last line of today's gospel reading is the same thing we heard on Wednesday when we came to receive our ashes. This year we had them sprinkled on the top of our head because of the COVID. Repent and believe in the gospel. And it was a reminder to us that during our Lenten journey, we look at the sin in our lives. We look at the areas where we need to grow closer to the Lord and try to avoid sin. And the first thing I want to observe about sin is that none of us commit sin deliberately. Let's face it. When was the last time you said to yourself, gee, I feel like sinning. What's a good sin I can commit? Well, of course not. We do so for all the wrong reasons. Deep down, whatever we do, we think we're doing something that's good for us, that's right, that's going to make us happy, that's going to give us peace. Unfortunately, in time, perhaps we discover that what we thought was going to help us isn't, and we realize it was a sin, and we need to turn away from that to God. But even the people who are doing the most sinful things imaginable, deep down think they're doing something good. Adolf Hitler, even killing millions of people, thought he was doing something good for Germany. So the problem, obviously, is what we hear from original sin. That Adam and Eve were told they could eat all the fruit of all the trees, but not the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Which means, don't try to decide for yourself what's right and wrong. I am God, you are not. I know all truth, you don't. Just because you think it in your head doesn't mean it is true. And just because you feel it in your heart doesn't mean it is right. And so we need to listen to God and not to what the thoughts in our hearts do and tell us is right and wrong. And sadly, of course, we know many people, in fact, do that. We spend our lives following what we think is right and going after that. And even when God tells us something must be avoided, sometimes people even get angry at God and angry at the church for teaching that and want it to be saved, want it to be changed. And they want us somehow to sprinkle holy water on something that the Lord has told us is sinful, just to all of a sudden make it acceptable for us because we want it. And so the journey of sin is to remember we don't sin deliberately. Maybe we're sinning because we know something is wrong, but we're like any compulsive behavior, we're just finding a hard time fighting it. Or maybe we just get so frustrated at a certain moment that we do something, or we say something, and almost immediately we realize, I shouldn't have said that, I shouldn't have done that. But our journey about overcoming sin is to acknowledge God, that God is the author of truth, and you and I are not, that we can make mistakes. Just because we think it doesn't mean it's right. And so the answer to happiness in the world, to make the world right again, is actually very simple. If everyone simply obeyed God and did everything God tells them to do, everything would be fine. There would be no conflicts among people. Because look at it this way. If I decide to follow my own heart and what I think is right, and how often we hear people saying that today, even people in Christianity saying, well, go out and figure what you think is right, what's your truth, and follow it. Well, that's the complete contradiction of the gospel. That is not at all what we are called to do. Just go out and figure out what you think is right. Rather, it's go out and follow what God tells you is right. Because I could think one thing is my truth, if you will, and it's good for me, but everybody else is not going to come to that same conclusion. Obviously, different people are all going to come to different opinions based on our own beliefs, our own experience, our own feelings. And so we're going to have different opinions, different truths, different beliefs, and inevitably they're going to clash. One person's truth is going to clash with another person's truth. And when that happens, that's when we get quarreling, that's when we get fights, that's when we get conflict, that's when we get war. People who each one believe what they're saying or doing is the truth, fighting against somebody else who thinks what they're saying or believing is the truth. And sometimes even in situations of war, both sides have claimed that they were fighting for God, doing the truth for Him. And so we realize we cannot listen to ourselves. We cannot simply go after what I think is right and what I believe is right. No, we must listen to God. And if God tells us something is good, then we must follow it. And if God tells us something is evil, then we must abandon it, no matter how much we might be desiring to hold on to it. Because only God's word is truth. My mind is not all truth, my heart is not all truth, and neither are yours. Only God's. So listen to God, follow what He tells us to do, and everything will be fine. And it would be very easy for us to be able to say, well, how do we follow God? Well, as some religions would say, and even a few denominations of Christianity, that, well, if it's something enjoyable, it's obviously wrong. So you can only, if you enjoy something, get rid of it. Well, no. There are certainly some things that are pleasurable that we know we have to abandon and get rid of and reject in our lives because we know they are sinful. But not everything. Lots of things God gives us are his gift to us, to give us pleasure, to give us joy, to give us happiness, and remind us as little hints of what he has prepared for us in heaven. You know, when we look at the Garden of Eden and original sin, we often reflect upon that one tree in the middle, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that God said, you shall not eat or even touch that tree. But we forget that God gave them all the other trees for food that were pleasant. And he says, you may eat of all of those appropriately, with proper discipline, so there's nothing wrong with having a good meal and enjoying it. Obviously, we can't be gluttons and go out and eat so much that we get ourselves sick, or even alcoholic beverages, that is perfectly fine, provided we don't have a problem with it, we don't overindulge, or anything else. Getting on rest is necessary, provided we're not becoming lazy and slothful and sleeping too much. Everything within context or within proportion are God's gifts to us. So we don't say, if you're enjoying it, it must be sinful. In fact, one of our Catholic historians, Hilaire Belloc, once said, wherever the Catholic sun doth shine, there is music and laughter and good red wine. And I certainly know that anytime I'm up at San Severio Shrine for the feast up there, we have lots of good wine and lots of good food and a heck of a lot of laughter. And that's not the only place that we have that. We have it all in our own lives, and I don't think any of us should feel guilty if we get together with our family for even just Sunday dinner. It doesn't have to be for a holiday, but we get together, we have a good meal, we enjoy each other's company. Well, none of us should feel guilty about that, because that's God's gift to us. The problem is we have an enemy at work, Satan himself. Satan, who in his war against God has caused the whole problem for us. That he's trying to hurt God by bringing us away from him and destroying the beauty of God's creation. And he knows if he can get us to turn against God, to rebel the way he did, well, he knows that hurts God because he's pulling God's beloved children away from him. And so he tempts us to try to turn away from God with all sorts of things that he knows from the very beginning is a lie. Things that are not going to bring us the happiness and the peace we think they will, but he makes them look so attractive to us and even look like it's so good for us to the point that we even fight God and say, God, you've got to give me this. And we ask the church to pour holy water on things that the church says are sinful and make that holy because it's going to lead me to God. And he doesn't play fair. Obviously, he doesn't tell us, oh, I'm tricking you. Of course not. And there's nothing that's a foul ball or a low blow to him. Everything, anything that will work, he does. And he also knows each and every one of us very well. He knows our own Achilles' heels. He knows the weakness you and I each deal with, and he hits each person individually with whatever is that weakness. For some people it's one problem, for others another. But he's very crafty. Now, some of you who are old enough to remember Flip Wilson. And Flip Wilson used to have his character Geraldine, and Geraldine's catchline was, the devil made me do it. Well, the good news is, the devil can't make us do anything. The devil can't force us to sin. All he can do is tempt us. Like any of you who ever go fishing with a rod and reel. If you go out to catch a fish, you have the hook there, you're hoping to get the fish to bite the hook. But the fish is not going to bite the hook with nothing on it. You've got to attract it. So you put something like a worm on the hook that ordinarily would be a good piece of food for the fish. And you try to attract it and get the fish to go after it. And you've hidden the hook inside the worm. If the fish is not interested, if the fish doesn't bite, the fish is perfectly safe. And it swims away without any problem. But if the fish is curious and goes after it and says, oh, look, here's a worm, I'm hungry, and eats the worm, and then you set the hook, now you can just reel the fish in. So sometimes the devil, like a fisherman, will use something that in other circumstances would be good for us. But in this situation, he's hidden the hook in there to ensnare us. Other times a fisherman will use maybe a plastic worm or a plastic fly, something that looks like food for the fish, but really isn't. And you use it to trick the fish into believing it's a piece of food, but it's only a piece of plastic. And if the fish goes after it, of course, it's caught, and you can reel them in. And other times, it was never anything good for the fish. You use something very flashy, a piece of metal that just catches the glint of the light, and it shines it, and the fish is curious and has to go after it to investigate, see what this thing is, and goes and bites it. That's the only thing a fish can do. It doesn't have hands to feel it. It bites it to see what it is, and then you set the hook, and you reel it in. Now, sometimes the fish notices right away it's been caught, and it starts to swim very erratically, realizing this was a mistake. I shouldn't have done this. And if it can spit the hook out, well, then it's free. But sometimes the fisherman reels in the fish very slowly, and the fish doesn't even realize it's caught until it's finally taken out of the water and put on the boat or the shore, and its life is over. And that's what the devil does with us. Sometimes when we sin, if we have good faith and a relationship with God, we realize right away, wait a minute, what I did was wrong. That wasn't good. And we turn to God and say, Lord, forgive me. Well, then the Lord literally takes us off the hook. Like the fish, he takes the hook out of its mouth and lets the fish swim free in the sacrament of reconciliation, going to confession. And anytime we turn to God and say, Lord, forgive me, he takes the hook out and sends us out again and says, go free. And hopefully we've learned not to make that mistake again. And so, fortunately, we have the Lord when we've acknowledged that. But like the fisherman who sometimes reels in the fish very slowly, sometimes the devil does that with us. And we're caught on the hook and we don't even realize we're being reeled in by him. Imagine if some of the other fish could tell the other fish again, well, spit that thing out. It's not good for you. And the fish says, well, no, I like it. I'm going to keep it. This is good. This is going to be wonderful for me. This is going in the right direction. Well, no matter how much they're telling him, the fish is fighting it until eventually it's caught by the fisherman and taken out of the water and dies. Oh, the devil does the same thing with us. Sometimes he pulls us in little by little, and we don't even realize we've been caught in his trap, in his lure. And people tell us, the church says, hey, you've got to let go of that. You've got to stop doing that. That's sinful. That's not a good gift from God meant to give you a hint of heaven. That's one of the devil's tricks. One of the things he's making look like a good gift of God, but it's got that hook in it. He's deceiving you. And sometimes people say, no, you're wrong. What I'm doing is fine, and you've got to stop telling me that I can't do that. And I'm going to find someone who tells me what I'm believing is right and good. And even, as I said, commanding the church to say, we want you to sprinkle holy water on this and tell us that what we're doing here is really good. But it's not. All the holy water in the world is not going to change the fact that Satan has caught us in his hook and is reeling us in. Only the Lord knows the difference between which are the gifts he's given us that we're meant to enjoy and which are tricks of the devil. So, how do we know the difference? We turn to Christ, we turn to the teachings of the church, and all the different ways he shows us, and follow him and say, the things that he says we can enjoy, great. Go out and enjoy them appropriately. And if he says, no, this is a sin, this is a trick from the devil, no matter how much we may be desiring it, we need to let go and say, that's only going to lead me to condemnation. I don't care if it seems like my whole life is ruined without this. If following that is not leading to heaven, it is not a gift from God, then it is a trick from the devil. And so that's what we try to do during our Lenten journey, to have that faith in God, that relationship with him, so that we know the difference and we desire a relationship with Christ, not a life of indulgence to sin. And the things that we do during Lent, the things we give up, for example, during our Lenten journey. Well, the reason we do that, even if it's something perfectly good, that there's nothing wrong with having, like chocolate, let's say somebody gives up chocolate for Lent, we deny ourselves something good to remind ourselves, to discipline ourselves, that we can't indulge ourselves in everything we want, so that when we are being tempted to something that we know is sinful, we will have the self-discipline to say, no, I should not do that, and to be able to be strong enough to say, I will not give in to that. And when we're finding it difficult, we call on the Lord for help, and he's there for us. The Lord does not want any one of us snagged. All we have to do is reach out to him, and he will let us go. He will let us off the hook time and time again. And so that is our good news today. The good news that indeed the Lord is there for us always to help us know his will and follow it. And sometimes we suffer because of our own sins, that we do things and we realize later we brought this upon ourselves, and it's just our reason, our fault alone, and we have no one else to blame but ourselves because we're suffering. But other times we end up suffering because of the sins of other people, that we've done nothing wrong, but other people have. San Silverio is a perfect example of that. When he was elected Pope, he probably didn't even want to be Pope, but he was elected, and so he accepted the duties. And there was a deacon by the name of Vigilius who was angry that Silverio was elected Pope and not himself, and so he schemed against the Pope. And he spread all sorts of lies, wrote letters that he forged with with the Pope's signature on it, claiming he was out doing all sorts of in cahoots with the Goths to hand over the city of Rome to them, and all sorts of horrible things that he got people to believe. Today we would call it fake news. And eventually they believed it, and they had him removed from the papacy. They publicly stripped him of all of his garments and sent him out to the Isles of Palmarola, where he was martyred. And I'm sure he probably sat there and said, I don't deserve this. I did nothing wrong. I was just elected Pope by the legitimate process. And this guy, in his anger, and his greed, and his sin, has caused me a lot of pain. Well, I'm sure what he did then was just offered it with Jesus and saying, Lord, you suffered, and you were falsely accused for me. I will suffer for you. For my own sins, offered as penance for things I've done, maybe the sins of other people that I know, or even souls in purgatory. And so we use our time of Lent to overcome our own sins, and in addition to our own abstinence, prayer and fasting, and giving to the poor, and prayer for other people as well, asking the Lord to help us to know what we can do to help other people know what things in their life are sinful that they need to set aside, and what are the gifts given us from God. For if we can trust in God and follow only what He teaches us, even if it should be painful for us to have to let something else go and embrace something different, we realize that God is the truth. I am the way, the truth, and the life, He said, and no one comes to the Father except through me. And by following Christ, we will know only through Him the happiness and peace that we so desire, the peace that only Christ can bring, the peace that indeed will set us free. May Jesus Christ be praised, now and forever.